I was 16. It was a hot summer's day in New York City. I climbed up a stage prepared to recount the names of 10 Iranian Jewish men who were being falsely imprisoned on charges of espionage. I practiced each name carefully, wanting the recitation of their names to somehow bring to life their humanity for all those who were listening. Along with the large protest crowd, there were about 100 other Jewish teenagers there. They came with me to experience social advocacy firsthand. It was my job to teach them. I was the coordinator of their summer program. Hi, microphone. I was the international board member in charge of their social action. So I brought them so they could learn. But that morning, on that podium, I'm the one who received the lesson of my life. For that was the day that I met Elie Wiesel. I remember being taken aback by how soft-spoken and frail he seemed. There with us on the stage, I looked at him and could only imagine the horrors he had encountered. When they invited him up to the microphone, I waited to hear his sad story. And then suddenly he communicated in passionate, forceful language and tones. He stood tall and raised his voice, and he told us all that silence was not an option. He demanded that we continue to work for a more just society and that we raise our voices together to speak up for those who were being silenced. Moved by his words, I approached him after to thank him. He taught me then that it was not yet a time for congratulations. It was great that we had come and brought other young people. It was important that we spoke up, but none of this deserved acclamation. As long as those men were still in prison, keep going, he said. We're not finished yet. Last weekend, though, Wiesel's personal efforts for perfecting the world did come to an end when he died at the age of 87. Israeli President Reuven Rivlin spoke of his sadness on the passing of this extraordinary man, Nobel Prize winner, and Holocaust survivor. Rivlin said, "Tonight we bid farewell to a hero of the Jewish people and a giant of all humanity." Elie Wiesel, of blessed memory, embodied the determination of the human spirit to overcome the darkest of evils and survive against all odds. His life was dedicated to the fight against all hatred, and for the sake of man as created in the image of God, he was a guide for us all. All week, his voice I heard in my mind. Keep going. We're not finished yet. And I realized it was our job, our turn to keep bearing witness and demanding change. All of us, every person who learned from him, his writings, and the dark horrors of his life, which he transformed into a moral mission of justice for all. It was now our turn to keep going. Then suddenly, the news made me cry again. More black men killed. My heart broke. Police officers gunned down. Horrifying. I found myself rereading my sermon from last Rosh Hashanah and recalling that the Religious Action Center, our movement's lobbying arm, wrote, "We live in a moment when the blood of our brothers and sisters of color cries out from the ground, from the streets, prisons, schools, and hospitals of America. And we cannot ignore the urgency of their voices or our own roles as allies, perpetrators, and complicit bystanders in ongoing racial injustice in our country." As I said last summer, the RAC's assertions are correct. If we are not allies, then at the very best, we are bystanders, a role Jews have sworn to never be, a role Elie Wiesel likens to evil itself. It is way past time for us all to take responsibility for the inequalities and atrocities our society perpetrates on Black Americans. At the same time, we must not turn our backs on those who have chosen to spend their lives policing our streets and keeping peace in our nation. We know, just as we would never want one hate-filled Jew to represent all of us, we should never assume that certain officers of the law represent all officers of the law, and therefore they should all be swept into one vast category of evildoers. No. So here's the important thing to remember, which so much of America seems to have forgotten today. We can be equally enraged by both. We do not have to be on the side of the innocent, unarmed Black man or the side of the police in Dallas. We can stand up for both by declaring that we stand for peace, we stand for hope, and we demand that violence and hatred must end. And though we sometimes feel as though there is nothing we can do, we can raise our voices, we can engage in dialogue, we can propose legislation, we can support candidates, officials, clergy, writers, and change makers of all kinds whose words and actions help lead to a more just society. And yes, there are specific facets to this debate which we can take on more closely. We can and should advocate for all people of all races, nations, religions, gender identities, sexual orientations. I'm not going to keep listing it. You name it, I'm including it. All people. For all people to have equal treatment under the law. We should advocate for equal access to education, equal access to voting, equal protection by our courts, and equal assumption of innocence by law enforcement agents. We can bring attention to racism and demand that new practices be implemented to determine who is truly qualified to keep the peace. But as we make our voices and votes heard on such topics, we must not villainize individuals or certain types of workers, assuming they're all bad. But rather, we must take on our policies, our practices, and our society in a more systemic way. For if we do not approach our problems globally, but rather we turn to anger towards a few, we too will become perpetrators of hate before long. As Rabbi Robert I. Kahn once wrote, God have mercy on those who build walls, who would jeer speakers to silence, jostle and strike those with whom they disagree, and create a climate of such fierce intolerance, of such ideological fanaticism, of such lunatic fringes, that to hate becomes a way of life, and to kill the inevitable result. God have mercy on those who would turn their backs on democracy, turn their backs on reasonable debate and discussion and thoughtful compromise, and create a climate in which violence flowers. Though Rabbi Robert Kahn's experience came from a different time in our history, his message, as it seems to always be, is still relevant. We must speak up and utilize democracy to the fullest extent we can, so that we may create a more just and kind civilization. And though I hope there is never again a headline of an innocent individual killed, whether they be a Black civilian or a white police officer, I know that we are not yet at that time when we can claim an evolved and loving society. But that doesn't mean we stop trying. Our tradition teaches us, even though it is not our responsibility to complete the work of perfecting the world, we are still not free to stop trying. Or as a wise man once told me, keep going. We're not finished yet. Shabbat shalom.